everybody. This is Sean Fraser from IWI. We'd like to thank everyone for taking the time out of the day to attend our Productivity Tools for Sage 300 webinar. And I'm just going to ask a little favor just to make sure that everybody can hear us okay. We did put everybody on mute, but I want to make sure people can hear us and see our screen. So if somebody could just type yes in the chat box, that'd be greatly appreciated. And thank you very much, Nancy. So what we're going to do here is we're going to walk through this webinar. And at this time, I'm going to let everybody know that questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. So feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and we will have people answer them. Rob and Nancy answer them at the end of the presentation. So in our Productivity Tools Sage 300 webinar, we're going to demonstrate how you can just reduce time, reduce the task duplication, just avoid errors using the following solutions. EFT processing, it's going to streamline your payment collection process by transferring your Sage 300 receipts and payments through electronic funds, EFT, to your banking software. And then document management link, it allows you to link multiple files and documents to Sage 300 fields and access them directly from your existing 300 screens. And then the Sox Check Approval, it takes control of your Sage 300 check printing process. So at this time, without wasting any time, I'm going to pass the controls over to Rob Lavery.
It's actually me that's going to go first. Thanks very much, Sean. And
sorry about that, Nancy.
No worries at all. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking the time with us today. We appreciate it. So I'm going to start with showing you the document management link and the check approval product. Now, you're going to see the two products working together, but just so you know, you can purchase either product separately. I just wanted to show that they do integrate. So with the document management link, we're giving you the ability to store documents outside of Sage 300 and view those documents from within. And so in my case, I'm storing documents just in my network folders. So on my C drive, I have a folder that I've named Orchid, and then a document folder. And then I'm choosing to store the documents based on the types. So today we're going to be looking at the AP documents, and I'm storing documents by vendor. So you notice I have a folder for each of my vendors, and within that folder, I have the documents that relate to that particular vendor. And today we're going to be looking at these three documents, entry 1, 2, and 3. I set up some information for us to save some time today. Now, this folder hierarchy would be completely up to you, depending on how you want to view and store your documents. So you can have as many folders as you like in whatever hierarchy you choose. And I'm storing documents in my network folders, but you could store documents in SharePoint if you're running Microsoft Server, or something like Google Docs or Dropbox. The product is providing a link from where you're storing those documents to the screen of Sage 300, and more importantly, we're linking to a field. In this case, it would be the vendor number field. Now, once you get this folder hierarchy in place, then the system can start to build that out for you. So in this example, if I were to store a document against a vendor that did not have a folder, the software can create that folder for me and then file the document appropriately. So when I open up the AP invoice batch screen or the AP invoice entry screen, we don't change anything about the way Sage 300 is behaving. We're just linking to the existing field on the screen. So as I mentioned, the first field that I'm linking to is the vendor number field. And then based on the value within the field, it knows which documents to show me. Now, if that were to change, if I were to add a vendor 1400, for example, you'll notice that I'll now see the document related to that particular vendor. So you can use this product to link to any field on any screen in any module of Sage 300. And if you have third-party products that are installed inside your Sage environment, you would be able to view documents against those screens as well. So we're going to see that integration with the Sox Check Approval product, although it's written by a third-party developer. and you're going to see it against the Orchid EFT product as well, and any module that installs inside your environment. So typically speaking, if you see the module on your menu of modules within Sage 300, you will be able to view documents against those screens as well. So you can link to any open field on the screen, and that includes the entry grid screens at the bottom here. You notice I have a link here to my GL account 1300, and that's just to signify that I can link to the entry grid fields as well as these header fields. Your only limitation would be something like a checkbox like this, or on some screens you'll see a drop-down list where you can choose from a list. Those are the types of fields that we can't link to, but other than that, you can link to any field on the screen, and that would include auto-generated fields, you know, your invoice number, your order number, your purchase order number. You would simply have to create the entry and then link the document to that entry. Now, the second window here, what I've done is I'm actually filtering against two fields on the screen. So although I'm storing my document under the vendor number, there's my entry 1 document stored in my vendor folder. But what I wanted to do in this case was I want to easily be able to see the one document that relates to this particular entry. So I've done a configuration around two fields where I'm saying store it based on my vendor number, but I want to view just the one document that relates to this entry. So I'm linking to this document number field as well as the vendor number field. And that's why I'm able to see this one document by itself. Now, you can configure the software to show you documents against one particular screen, or you can say, you know, in the case of my vendor, I've configured it to say, I want to see those vendor documents against every field in Sage 300 that has that vendor number field on it. So anywhere that vendor number appears in Sage, I want to see those documents. So you have some flexibility. If you wanted to store sensitive documents, then we do respect network folder security. So if you put security around one of your network folders, then Document Management Link will respect that. So you do have the ability to store sensitive documents as well. So for today's purposes, for the Sox Check Approval product, I created this batch number 40. You can see I've just named it for our webinar today. And I've put 3 entries in. And the reason I've done 3 is with the check approval product, you can put dollar value thresholds. So in this particular case, the way I have the software configured, I've said anything under $2,000, I just want it to go to my general manager for approval. But anything that exceeds $2,000, I need that to go to the controller to review. So I've got my entry number 1 here for $517 that we'll expect to go to the general manager for approval. And then I have an entry here for $4,100 that will go to my controller. And I've added a third entry that will go to the controller simply because I want to show you that you can decline any payment within a payment batch. So, you know, we're not going to hold up the entire payment batch if there's one entry in that batch that you. Then you have an option to say, if I decline a payment, either just remove that entry from the batch and the user will re-enter that payment entry when I'm ready, or create a new batch for those things that I've declined, and I can review those at a later date. So I'm going to show you that we'll decline one of the payments within the payment batch. So I didn't post the invoice entry because I wanted to show you that we're not changing anything about the way that you would enter your entries within Sage 300. So that's the batch that we're going to be working with today, this batch number 40 that I've named IWI Client Webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and post that invoice entry batch. And then we'll move into the Tyrox Check Approval product now. So it's going to install just as on your menu of modules, and there's just one setup screen associated with it. So with the check approval, we're putting controls around your payment batch in accounts payable where we're forcing an approval before someone can print a check or post the batch. Now, the approvals, users do not have to log into Sage 300 to do the approval. We're going to set up a SQL instance. In my case, I've just called it an approval database. So we set up a SQL instance, and then we come to this database tab and we hit the create button, and that's going to create our approval console. That approval console sits out on your desktop or on your start menu, or if you wanted, you could run that approval console from something like an iPad if you have the appropriate infrastructure for that. It was actually initially designed for someone that wanted to do approvals on the go from their iPad. Now we're going to set up a Sage 300 user ID and password here. And what this does is when the approval takes place in that approval console, there's no additional process for the user. It's going to automatically go into Sage 300 in the background and release that batch. Because the minute the batch gets submitted for approval, it gets locked. And so as soon as the approval takes place, we're going to use this user ID and password. I've set mine up as admin, but these are the users I have set up in Sage 300. So you can choose any user. They must have the appropriate rights to be able to unlock that batch and post it. But that's what this user ID is used for. Now, as I mentioned, for today's purposes, I've got this set where checks above a certain limit will be approved at higher levels. So as I mentioned, my first level of approval is my general manager. These, by the way, are just the users I have set up in Sage 300. So these would be the people that work within your organization are listed here. And with a tick, you can signify who needs to do an approval at any of these levels. I've said my level 1 person has a limit of $2,000, and beyond that, I want it to go to the controller. I could do up to 3 levels of approval. So you can do 1, 2, or 3 levels of approval and nominate users at each level to do those approvals. Now, you could also say, I want every payment approved at all levels. So in this case, it would go to the general manager, and then all payments would go to the controller. Or you can just specify a group of users and say, these are the users that I want it approved. So it would actually go out to everyone at the same time, and those users need to approve it for it to move on. Now, down here at the bottom, these are the payment codes set up in accounts payable. And so you can choose to exclude certain types of payments from needing or requiring approval. So Rob's about to show you the EFT product. And typically when EFT gets set up, we suggest that you set up a payment code called EFT so that you can easily identify those payments. And so you could say, well, because my EFT product is installed and I've got that as an automated process, I really only want to be reviewing paper-based checks. So you could say exclude those EFT payments. I just want to review and approve payment-based checks. Or you could do all payments if you choose to. The data tab will just show you by company those things that have gone through the system for approval. So if you wanted to go back and review, you could go back and review anything that's gone through. And you'll notice I have more than one company listed here. So you can run this product against multiple companies at the same time. So if you have approvers that are responsible for approving across companies, you can choose to filter those payment requests into the same approval console, and you'll see that in my system. Or you could say that each company has a different approver, therefore just send theirs into their approval console. You can choose to send things into the approval console. So you can say send everything in as approved, and the user will review and uncheck those things that they don't want to approve. Or send everything in as unapproved. I want to force that user to activate the tick box to signify that they've reviewed it. Or you can say, I'm going to set this dollar value threshold, send anything under that threshold in as approved. So my user is then going to focus on those things that are unchecked, meaning they're above that threshold that I've sent, set. So those are the ones that I really want them to look at. And you'll see here, put checks not approved in a new batch. So we'll see that in action today. When I decline that payment, it's going to create a new batch for us. And then finally, there is email notification. So the emails will go out throughout the approval process to let users know when they need to do an approval. And ultimately, you can send an email back to the person that initially submitted it for approval, and that lets them know that it's ready for them to go ahead and post the batch and print those checks. So if we go back up into accounts payable, although we replaced the screen with our own screen, that's why it's called an extended payment batch, we're not changing anything about the way that you're creating those payments. So I'm just going to quickly create the payments for those entries. And we'll just call this IWI. And we've got entry 1. And you'll notice document management link is popping up against this screen as well. So this is the configuration that we've done against this screen. And we were working with our vendor 1200. You notice when I popped up the Finder, the document management link window opens against the Finders as well. So, you know, there's no limit to where you can see these documents. So let's go ahead and fetch, and here's our entry 1. So I'm going to create a payment for that. And then let's call up our vendor 1200 again. And we'll find our entry 2. So there's our entry 2 that we'll add. And then finally, we will add our entry 3 here. And let's just put in here entry 3. And we'll go back and we'll add here entry 2. Sorry, that's 3. Okay. So there's nothing unusual about the way that I've created those payments. So that should be no different for any of your users. And you'll notice here I can open up any of the documents within the document management link window. So that holds true for all types of documents. So if you have a specialized program that has specialized type documents, as long as the user has the necessary program, they can open any type of document through the document management link window. Okay, so here's our batch here with our 3 payments in it. And if I were to now try to print the checks and post the batch, it's going to tell me you can't do that because it has not yet been approved. So this batch is currently sitting in a lock status. And what I need to do here is this additional button that we've added to this screen is submit that for approval. The minute I submit that for approval, it goes into, it's tried to send me an email, but I don't have it set up. But it's gone to an in progress status. So anyone else coming into this screen can easily see that this payment batch is in the progress of getting approved. And I can click on that button and I'd be able to see who had done approvals and where it would be sitting at any point in time. So as that message popped up, it was trying to send an email to us to let us know that that payment is sitting for approval. So when I now come to the approval console on my desktop, I can log in as our first approver, which is our general manager. The document, the GoToMeeting panel is getting in my way. And you can see here, here's my sample company, and it'll be a tree view. So I have 2 companies coming into this approval console. So there's my Sage sample company, and then I have my Tyrox company, and here's our IWI batch. So as we expected, we're only seeing the 1 payment within that batch that relates to that's below $2,000. So that's why for our general manager, we're just seeing that 1 payment. And they've done an additional configuration. So typically document management link can only be used within Sage 300. But in this case, they've written a special integration where I can actually view those documents from this approval console. So even though I'm not inside Sage 300, they wrote this additional piece that you can view those documents from the approval console as well. But I'm going to go ahead and say I approve this. And yes, we're approving that. And it's telling me that that payment is now approved. But now we need to log in as our controller. And we're going to approve one of the payments and decline another one. So here is our batch, our IWI batch, showing those 2 additional payments that were within that batch. Again, I can see those documents. And some information at the top you're seeing is the company that this batch relates to, the description of that batch, the grand total, the batch number, the bank that it's drawn against. So what we'll do in this case is I'm going to say for this $8,000, I'm not ready to approve that yet. So I'm going to untick that box and save it. And it's saying, oh, you're declining that. So can you please put in a comment as to why you're declining that? So I'm just going to say pay later. And that is kept in the log. So you can see why a payment was not approved. We'll go ahead and approve this. So what we've done is we're approving this $4,100 payment. We're declining this $8,200 payment. So I'm going to say yes to that. And now when I go back into Sage 300, I haven't run any additional process. But when I go back, you'll see here's our IWI batch that's now sitting as an approved status. I can now print those checks and post the batch. Do you want to cancel? And we'll say no to that. But you notice I can print the check and post the batch now. And it's created this additional batch for me for our $8,200 payment that I declined. Is now sitting in a check not approved for batch number 49. So it does give you a reference back to the original batch that it was in. And it's sitting in a submit for approval status. So that's an overview of the Sox Check Approval and the Orca Document Management link. I believe we're going to open up to questions at the end of the presentation today. So at this point, I will turn it over to Rob to show you the EFT. But before I do, let me just kind of tie this all together for you. I have EFT running in my system. And so now that that payment batch has been approved, which I didn't actually post it, so perhaps I should do that. So let's go ahead and post this batch. We'll print that check. And we'll post the batch. Okay, so that posted our batch number 49. And this would be where you would then come to EFT and you can come to this create EFT file. And I can say for batch 49, I want to create the EFT file. So I'll stop at that point. Rob will show you the features within EFT and then what happens when you create that EFT file.
All right, thank you very much, Nancy. Good morning again, everyone. Thank you for your time. We appreciate it. So just to piggyback on what Nancy was just saying there, as you can see, the process within Sage 300 is not going to change in terms of how you enter AP invoices, enter your AP payments. You're still going to go through a similar process, except that now with the Tyrock Sox Check Approval, you're able to approve those payments online. And with the document management link, you can also see a copy of the invoice that you're paying. So as Nancy just said, the whole purpose of EFT then is to eliminate the need to produce a paper-based check and be able to generate a file which you upload to the bank and then have the bank process payment to your vendor. Now, as part of EFT, just to be clear, you can do payments to vendors. You can also pull money from your customers, a direct debit as we call it. And we've also added a payroll component where you can send a direct deposit to your employees. So there are 3 transactions that you can manage within the EFT software. And one of the major requirements to do that is to specify what we call a file type for the transaction that you wish to process in EFT. And you'll see that there's literally hundreds of different file types, depending on whether you're doing a positive pay transaction, which is still producing a paper-based check, but sending a file to the bank to verify which checks have been produced. So that might be a stepping stone for you, moving from paper-based checks and authorizing payment. The next step would be actually sending payments online, which would be an online payment. But I want you to notice as well that we do international money transfers depending on the bank. These are US banks that we're looking at. This is a global solution, so we also support banks in Europe, Asia, South Africa, all around the world. And in addition to standard check payments, we also support wires. We can support PayPal. We can also support credit card like Amex. But I want to be clear here that we're not a merchant account. We're not actually authorizing the credit card. We're just simply processing an approved credit card transaction. So there are a number of different payment transactions that we support. And that would include also Interac bulk emails. So we've had a number of different requests to do different types of payment transactions, depending on the nature of the payments that you wish to make. So there's a PayPal example there. And again, you notice that we've got these formats for banks and financial institutions all around the world so that we can support transactions from a Canadian company like yourselves to any vendor anywhere in the world. And the key is that when we're looking at Canadian banks, which is the most likely ones you're using, even within Canada, if we look at something like the Bank of Montreal, these banks typically have multiple file types because they offer different types of payment services for different types of payment transactions. And as they enhance these services, either to add more security or support different file types, we have to add those to our system. And so we need to constantly be updating these file types. So in order for you as a Sage 300 customer to use the system, you have to ask for what's called the specification from your bank so that we can compare that to our existing file formats. And then based on that specification, if we've got a compatible file format, we'll recommend you use that format and set that up under EFT Banks. And if not, as long as you're running a current version of Sage 300, which is currently Sage 2018, 19, and 20, then we'll add that file type to the system at no additional charge to you. And then you'll set up that file type within EFT Banks. So if I select this one for Bank of Montreal, then it will tell me what pieces of information I need in order to be able to support payments to vendors through my bank, Bank of Montreal. And then to generate the EFT file, we'll specify a path to somewhere on our network that file is created and stored until we're ready to upload it to the bank website. And we can also create automated processes. If you're using SFTP, which is a file transfer protocol, which is secure over the web, and that will ensure that not only have your payments been approved, but you can also approve when the EFT file goes up to the bank. And you can automate that process with an acknowledgement or an approval using what we call an extender workflow. But here again is where we can also handle payroll as well as receipts or direct debits from a customer's account. And in addition to payments, we can also process AR refunds. So there's actually 4 transaction types that we support depending on the transaction that you want to automate within Sage 300. So once we've got the bank file confirmed and we've set that up with our bank, we'll then want to create the EFT vendor profile for all the vendors within accounts payable that we want to pay electronically. So we have access to all of our AP vendors, we choose the vendor, and then we attach their specific bank details for the bank that we're sending money to. Now, I want to point out the status, because you notice there's a note here that says the status must be active in order to perform EFT transactions. This is another control feature that we've built into EFT. So what we can do is when we're setting up the system, we can tell the system that our default status is entered, and then have another person come in and switch to the active status once they've reviewed what's been set up for that EFT vendor. And then at that point, because the active status is in place, you can then start sending payments to those vendors. If you're going to be doing a lot of different types of vendors, then there is an import feature where you can import in a standard file type like Excel or CSV. This is the standard import routine within Sage 300. So you could set up a number of different vendors at one time in a spread database and import them into the EFT vendors to streamline the setup of those master files. Now, the other thing I want you to note is the email. Because we're sending these payments electronically, it wouldn't make sense for you to then turn around and print off the remittance advice and have to fold it, stuff it, mail it to your vendors. So we support the email, whether it's the EFT email setup or the AP vendor delivery method. So if it's the AP vendor delivery method, then within the AP vendor master file, you're probably familiar on the processing page that you can have email or contacts email, which would pick up the email on the address page or the email on the contact page. So in addition to the standard email from AP vendor, we've added the extra one here for EFT vendors, which will be the primary email address. If you leave this blank, then it will default to one of the AP vendor methods. So that's how we would send remittance advice details. And so all of this is configured through our options. When we're setting up EFT for the first time, we have a couple of options for you to choose from, and we're going to recommend some to you based on best practices. But the primary bank would be the bank file type that we would choose, and then the AP email for emailing remittance advices, we would configure to go directly to the email server so that we can send a bulk email with multiple emails at one time, and we don't have to authenticate each individual email address. And then there'll be an email template that you set up for that email message. So there's one for direct debits when you're pulling money from customers, there's the payments, and then there's the payroll. So for payments, you would specify the wording of the email document, and then we have various variables where you can put in the payment date, a list of documents that you're paying, and the company name, depending on what your company name is, and who the vendor contact is. So the system will automate the generation of these emails for you, so you don't have to do those manually. So coming back to the options then, we have the email option for SMTP, and then when you're creating the EFT file, you can tell the system, would I like to create one EFT file for every one payment batch, or do I want to allow multiple payment batches to be included with one EFT file? And usually the answer to that question is based on how the bank is charging you for your EFT transactions. The next option is, do I allow unposted batches or not? And Nancy made reference to this in her part of the presentation, where you would typically say, no, I do not want to allow unposted batches. I want the batch to be posted, because that's how you're going to ensure that they're approved and posted in advance of creating the EFT file. So you know that if it's posted, if you're using Tyrock Sox Check Approval, it's also been approved. There are some cases where you might want to allow unposted batches, but best practices would suggest no. So you would say no to unposted batches. And as you're probably familiar, if you make changes to unposted batches, there's no record of that change in the database of Sage 300, unless you're using some sort of an audit logging tool. So just want to be clear that saying no to the unposted batches would be our recommended practice. Now, the next thing is allowing the system to skip over vendors or to display an error and abort the creation of the EFT file. The difference here is that if I have a blended payment batch of both EFT and non-EFT vendors, I want to tell the system to skip over the non-EFT vendors and only create the payment to my EFT vendors. Now, best practices would suggest that we separate those payment batches, create one payment batch for EFT vendors and a separate payment batch for non-EFT or check vendors. And in some cases, companies will actually go to their bank setup and create a separate series of document numbers for the EFT vendors versus the non-EFT vendors. And there you have a nice clean audit trail for the different types of payment transactions. And the way we would recommend you do that is by using the create payment batch function within AP, because here you can specify criteria, one of which could be the payment code. So if you set up a payment code for your EFT vendors and use EFT, then it's easy for you to segregate EFT vendors from non-EFT vendors and creating your payment batch that way, and then using the Tyrox extended payment batch to go in and do the approvals. So next up would be, in terms of the options, do I want to allow selective payments? So when I'm on the EFT create EFT file, if I say I want selective payments, then I can go in and choose individual payment entries from within the batch and put a flag beside them. So in the case where you wanted to make a quick payment to a vendor, even though you've set up a whole batch of payments, you could go in and create an EFT file for just one payment if you wanted to. And then the system knows that that vendor's been paid. So when you generate the EFT file against that payment batch, it's not going to pay the vendor twice. It's going to flip the flag in the database to say that vendor has been paid for that invoice, and it's not going to duplicate payment for you. So a couple of other areas I want to touch on before I finalize the presentation for today, and that is the logs that we keep in the system. There are both reports as well as logs in the system that keep track of every time you create an EFT file. We will assign a unique EFT file creation number. We have a date and a timestamp. We tell you the type of transaction that it is, a payment versus a receipt versus a refund. We tell you the user within Sage 300 who created that EFT file, the bank against which they created that file, where that file is stored on the network prior to transmission to the bank, and the dollar value of the transactions within that payment file. So that's a log of every time you create an EFT file. We also create a log as you're setting up your customers and vendors within the system. So if it's a vendor, there's also a date and a timestamp for that record and the details of what information was populated to each of the fields and the Sage user who set up that vendor. So this is where, when you're setting up the customer or vendor, you see that the old value was entered, which is what we could default the status to, and then someone else could come in and change it to active. And that's a control measure for you, creating segregation of duties. But whether you use that or not, we're logging all of those data records into EFT. So you can go back and review through the inquiry or generate a report. Now, in terms of the remittance advices, there are print advices that you can either print, but we'd recommend using the vendor customer email, and then you can use the email message template. And it will email out the remittance advice with a copy of the payment being made as a PDF or an RPT form. And as an environmental control, there's one last thing I want to show you, and that's the transfer details report. As you're creating these EFT file payments, you can generate a transfer details report that will show you in detail all the vendors that have been paid and the date and the time that they were paid when the EFT file was created. Again, the bank, the account number, whether it was successful, and the dollar value of that transaction. So as an environmental control, you could take your posting journal in AP, your EFT transfer details report, and compare that with the report that comes back from the bank, and you get a three-way match to confirm that the payments approved in AP were also the payments that we uploaded through EFT, and the bank has confirmed that with their report back to us. And what you'll find is that once you've verified that through a couple of payment cycles, you'll have confidence in the system that it's making payments correctly, and nobody would be able to intercept these files. Because one of the big reasons people employ EFT solutions is to avoid check fraud and identity theft. And now, of course, with the pandemic that we're living through, more people are working remotely, either from home or some remote office, and you're not able to go in and do physical checks for review and signing purposes. So a solution like EFT is very timely based on the new environment that we have to live with today. So that basically summarizes what I wanted to share with you today around the EFT processing solution. And now we'd like to open up the floor for questions if you have any.
Hi, thanks, Rob and Nancy. We actually do have a few questions, so I'll start by starting off with the first one here. Can you unlink previously linked documents?
So that'd be a question for Nancy.
Yes, I believe so.
Hi there. Hi. So what you're doing is you're just storing the document in a network folder. So you can simply remove that document from the network folder and you would no longer see it in the document management link window.
Perfect, thank you. And I just want to remind anybody, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box right now. We have a few more questions here as well. Can I do approvals remotely?
Approvals for your payments, yes. Well, you can do with I'll let Rob speak to EFT, but the check approval product, yes, you can run that approval console on an iPad. You just need the right infrastructure for that. It's Windows based, I believe. But we can get you that information, but yes, you can run it from an iPad, so you can run the approvals for the payments remotely.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you wanted to do an approval on the EFT file itself, which would be a little redundant if you're using Tyrock Sox Check Approval, we would use what we call an extender workflow, which is something that you can approve within Sage 300, or now we have something called a remote action service where we support a web app. So you can do it remotely as long as you have access to the web. You can do it on any type of mobile device.
Okay, thank you. Can you link files to AR and AP only?
No, you can link the files to any screen in any module of Sage 300 and any third-party product like the EFT that you just saw. As long as it's inside your Sage environment, you can link to any screen, any field on any screen.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. I have another question here. Will these tools work for Sage 300 in a Mac environment?
Yes.
Okay, so it looks like that is it for questions. I'll give it a couple seconds. If anybody else wants one, type it in at the last second. Otherwise, we would like to thank Nancy and Rob for presenting, as well as thanking everybody for attending, taking the time out of their day. Our contact information is up there. If you're dealing with somebody directly, feel free to reach out to them, or just go through sales@iwigroup.ca, or call our local number or toll-free number and hit extension 101. And we will follow up with everybody that's attended as well and answer any question and get you any other additional information you're looking for. So once again, thank you very much for attending, and everybody have a great day and stay safe. Bye.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks, everyone.